the last one before lunch. So this is the one that's stand between you and getting some enjoy. I'd like to welcome Rinaldo De Paolis to the stage, please, the founding director and CTO of Novata Solutions.
Exciting topic just before lunch. So, for those of you that don't know me, I'm actually quite a shy and timid person, so you'll have to bear with me as I go through this presentation. And as I said, I realise that I am between you and lunch, so I'll make this hour and a half presentation go as quickly as possible. So those of you that don't know me, as was mentioned, I'm the co-founder, director and CEO of Novata Solutions. I've been in and around the Perth ICT scene for roughly 20 years. And I am a father, I'm a husband, and I'm also a avid dog lover. A couple of fun facts: I actually started life as a chef, and I've recently started Olympic lifting. And the nice thing about Olympic lifting is that you don't have to have a body like a don, so you can be a little bit rotund and still get away with it. So today's topic is around governance automation, around controlled documents. But I think I'll go back and ask the question, what is a controlled document? And this quite often gets sort of muddled up with other sort of interpretations, but the way we see it is a controlled document is something that needs to go through some sort of lifestyle with a life cycle with some governance, some review, approval sort of approach to it. And they're generally things like policies, plans, procedures, work instructions, etc. And specifications. As I said, this quite often gets muddled up with what other people are thinking a control document may be. There's actually some risks of a poor controlled document management solution, and that is that the wrong information can be used or referenced. And that can be quite dire in certain industries. So if you think of the mining industry, if there's a work instruction on how to repair a bit of heavy industry, there's potential risk that someone may lose their life. In the health care industry, there may be a procedure around pharmaceuticals and medication. That could also have some dire consequences as well. There's issues around, time cost overruns, people not being able to get the right information, gaps between communication. There could be poor or wrong decisions made because they don't have access to the right information. You can miss the opportunity to satisfy or delight a customer. And as Vito was saying before, we need to be customer-centric. You could potentially lose your competitive edge because the wrong information is being sort of shared. Loss of reputation, and failing to comply with legal or regulatory requirements. So there's some valid reasons, as you can see, that why you want to be automating a lot of these. So overall, there's better governance, stronger access to access controls, separation of concerns. I mean, I can go through and read all these, but I'll let you go through them. But I think ultimately what we see in a lot of organisations is that things are pretty manual in a lot of organisations. And as I said earlier, controlled documents can be cluttered and mixed in with other document types, leading to a really poor experience for the end user. We see a lot of document sprawl, so documents or controlled documents sprawled across multiple locations. Again, people aren't able to find information, therefore when they do find a document or a controlled document, they tend to save it on their desktop or save it somewhere where they can find it or email it around. And that in turn leads to issues around not having the right currency. Duplication of information. We quite often find when we're doing audits that you have very similar documents that are conflicting or contradictory to each other. You may have a policy related to X, and it's different from the policy relating to X, which is on another area of their environment. Multiple storage locations across the same organisations, and couple of examples are they'll have several SharePoint sites or somewhere in OneDrive or Dropbox or file shares or network shares and other systems as well. Stale or incorrect information, just because a policy is written once, it needs to be reviewed and updated. There's no way of identifying the currency of information. We see things around, as I said, manual reviews, multiple versions of the same document, difficulty knowing what is a final version when these manual reviews are happening. There's no governance and controls around the approval, who's responsible for approving a policy. We see that there's no data classification. We see things like there's no easy way to find or discover the documents. No archiving strategy. What happens when that policy or that controlled document becomes end of life? What do we do with it? We see that there's no retention or disposal plans. No easy way for end users to provide feedback on a document. And that to me is a really important one. Just because we've written it, we need to elicit feedback from the end users. So we've actually come up with a bit of a plan on how we approach these problems. And we have a series of initial governance and control document decision points that we sort of workshop with organisations. And I'm going to share this with you. A little of this is some IP that we've developed over the years, but feel free to take photos. I'm not sure if these slides are going to be shared later on. But, the initial questions or decisions we ask organisation is who can create, approve and archive control documents? Does everybody know who's responsible for that in their organisation? Do they need a naming convention these days? What templates are required for each document type? Who are the document owners? So who's ultimately responsible for that document creation? When does a controlled document need to be reviewed? Is it 3 months, 6 months, 12 months, 24 months? And do we have the mechanisms to do that? Do all users within the organisation need to access controlled documents, or are some of those documents only available for a subset of users? Do we allow guest users to access controlled documents, i.e. contractors that may need to come in to your organisation and see those work instructions or follow your procedures and policies? And if we do require external people to access your documents, how do we recertify them to make sure that they are still within that external organisation, that they still need to have access to those documents? How do we have a data classification schemes? How do we classify data? And how do we protect our data as well? We see a lot of this is just innately not done within organisations, or if it is done, it's not done well. Do we need some sort of retention policy? And if we do, what's it based on? Is it based upon your internal policies? Is it based upon industry regulation? Is it based upon legal requirements? What about things about, deleting data that may be considered a liability and is no longer needed? How do we archive? What is your archiving strategy? We just simply make it read-only. We watermark it and move it. How do we monitor and manage orphan documents? So an orphan document is a document that doesn't have an owner. So you may have put, Harry Brown as the owner within the organisation. But what if Harry Brown's no longer there? How do we manage that? How do we monitor and manage the current control documents? And do we have the required licenses and permissions across your system? Most organisations, we find, have a lot of the sort of building blocks to build out a controlled document management solution. We tend to find that most organisations either have an M365 license within their organisation and/or are using Azure or some other cloud services. And with a lot of those, we can actually build out a very efficient controlled document management solution. So how do we do that? How do we deal with governance automation and building this out? We use things like Power Automate and Logic apps to do things like approvals, document feedback, reviews, archiving, and other workflows. We make sure we have separate areas for people that are authoring documents, publishing those, and archiving. We don't try and muddle them all up. You know, we need to assign the right licenses across the environment. You need to configure your policies, you know, across Office 365, your retention policies, sensitivity labels. We look at an automated governance monitoring solution, and that can either be done by, again, Power Automate, Logic apps, or third-party solutions. And we set those sensitivity labels to protect content within the Microsoft 365 environment. And there's a cheeky little plug there as well. You can always come and see us because, you know, we've been doing this for a long time, and I think we've got a fairly robust solution to this. So, as I was saying, my presentation is going to go for about an hour and a half. So, I've actually rushed through it, and I've actually left a lot of time for you guys to actually look at networking now. So, having said that, I'm actually just going to open it up for questions, so I've got plenty of time.
Okay. Question, what about MS Teams and document management?
Yeah, absolutely. So, as an example, we have an app that actually sits within Teams that looks at that centralised controlled document area and sort of displays all that by search. So when we build things these days, we just don't build with SharePoint or whatever. We make sure that whatever we build has an accompanying Teams app. It's become very prevalent. And as we know, we're not always working at the office or whatever. We want to have access to our policies and our procedures on the go. We deal with a lot of aged care providers, and a lot of these frontline workers need access to those policies, and they're all using Teams. So, you know, the thing for us is making sure that, you know, whatever we build around a controlled document management solution, that it's accessible through Teams. And I'll go back to a couple of slides before. You know, we talk about controlled documents in here, and we have our sort of departmental working type documents, and they lie between Teams and SharePoint. But we make sure we have a very precise way of having a single area where all those controlled documents can be sort of found at central location.
That's fine. Really a segue to that, email. What about the documents and email? That's a nightmare.
You mean, so with that question there, is that about sharing controlled documents and email, or?
I think it's about email, documents getting lost in emails and the retention of those documents that just get emailed around and don't make it into a records management system.
Yeah, and we're quite purposefully saying that controlled documents are not necessarily records. You know, they are those policies and those procedures. So, you know, we try and encourage our the organisation we work with to not send email of documents, send the link. So some of the solutions we put in is, you know, very easy to get the link, to send that link out to people. So it's about getting people back into the system and not necessarily pushing information back out via email.
Do you provide an AI-based information classification solution with Office 365?
We do.
That's got to be a loaded question.
Not a loaded question. Hands up who asked that one. So we do. So we have an AI-based auto-classification feature that leverages cognitive services, and we match information we find within the document against some sort of taxonomy of terms associated with it, and then there's still an approval process to make sure that the tagging is correct.
Okay. Do the Office 365 technologies from a records management perspective meet the WA State Records Act?
That's a good question. There are third-party add-ons that make it comply. From a State Records Act, I can't answer that. You know, I'm not talking about records today, but certainly from Controlled Document Management Solution it does. Yeah, we have certain vendors that we partner with to sort of comply with State Records Act over here?
No, I mean, that's obviously a big question as well.
Yeah.
I mean, there is a big crossover between controlled documents and record management.
Yeah, there is.
One tends to go with the other sort of thing. But could you comment on the ROI and the business case for controlled documents?
Yeah, I suppose I'd answer that in saying, what's the cost of getting the wrong procedure or the wrong process out to somebody? What's the cost of, someone following the wrong procedure and potentially harming themselves? I think that cost is a lot greater than the ROI of actually being able to find the right information. I think we see a lot of people wasting time, lack of productivity in searching for the right information, and quite often when they've gone through a search, they'll ask their colleague to send them a copy, and that copy's not always correct. So, yeah, I think I can't give you the hard and fast dollar value of the ROI, but I can certainly tell you that we've seen productivity gains and things being done more effectively and not just necessarily efficiently.
You did finish earlier, note this up as we
questions.
One of the challenges is document metadata classification. What automated solutions do you recommend in the market? Is this another loaded question?
Yes.
Do you have to, yes, we've got
No, it's not a loaded question, this one, no. So, some organisations we work with either have third-party classification engines that we look into to be able to look at classifying their documents. Most organisations we deal with are not quite there from a maturity model, and so we try and work with them to understand what their business classification scheme is, and then based on that we'll build out some using cognitive services in Azure to try and map any, as I said earlier, sort of match any of the contents of the documents to their existing term set or their business classification scheme.
How do you enable organisations to automatically demonstrate compliance with ISO standards?
So we've actually implemented our controlled document management in a lot of organisations to comply with ISO. So a lot of engineering companies we work with having a BMS to make sure that it adheres to their ISO standards. So we work with the organisations. Most of the organisations we work with have existing internal auditors or quality managers that work through that with us. I can tell you now, not every organisation works the same. They all have different interpretations. They may have different certification vendors, and each of those are different. I can tell you that even being an ISO certified organisation ourselves, the way we do document management, the way we do our quality management differs from other organisations we deal with.
How long do you find it takes a typical organisation culturally to change their document management habits when you start going down this path? Have you got any tips?
Yeah, change management, definitely. The work we find is you can put the best solution in place, you can, deliver a project on time, on budget, but if it's not adopted, it's a failed project. That change begins from day one. It's really important, and it's important to make sure that the users understand the value of the right information. And unless they understand that value, they'll circumvent the process. They'll spend more time circumventing the process than actually adhering to it. So it's about getting them to really buy into that change, buy into understanding the value of what it takes to get the right information to the right people at the right time.
Slightly out of left field, this one. Have you experienced of putting all documentation and how-tos into a wiki so everyone can add notes to them? I've seen most documents improved to the links better.
We don't, we haven't. We've seen very similar things done in wikis. A lot of the organisations we deal with are quite tightly governed by regulatory sort of authorities and bodies. So what we do though provide is that feedback mechanism, the ability for an end user to provide feedback, even post-publishing and post-approval. You know, it's important to get that feedback, whether it's as simple as there's a typo in the document or this particular policy now no longer relates to us. So, yeah, that feedback mechanism is probably more important, in my opinion, especially in those highly regulated industries.
And there's another one here. So the solutions that you do, are they out of the box, or is every system bespoke for clients?
So we do have an out-of-the-box solution, and we do have a recommended way of implementing it. Having said that, every organisation wants, you know, their own sort of flavour to that. But 90% of what we do is we have an out-of-the-box solution.
I think we'll probably call it that. That's quite a lot of questions, so thanks for that, Rinaldo.
No worries.
Yes, you can all join me in thanking Rinaldo.